So as you, I'm sure, know, today we will hear from Maria Pia Paganelli on her research with Jimena Hurtado on Smith and Menger. And if you've read the paper, you know that they are arguing in quite a provocative direction, sort of reversing what we teach in history of economic thought. So I might need to change my lectures for next year, but I'm excited to hear the presentation. And if you, I'm sure Maria and Jimena are known to this crowd, but just in case, Maria is currently an associate professor at the university. Yes.
I will promote it.
Full professor. Okay, great. Okay, so it's okay. Full professor at Trinity University in San Antonio. She's an expert in the history of economic thought, in particularly on Adam Smith. And I think you had a book published in 2020, right? The guidebook to Smith's Wealth of Nations. And Jimena is a professor at the Universidad Los Andes, and she's interested in economic philosophy and contemporary economic theory, and she has earned her PhD from University of Paris. So with that, thank you all for coming. Thank you to the presenters for their interest in participating in EPERN, and the screen is yours. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Marta. It's a great pleasure to be able to present this work that Jimena and I have written to this audience. I'm going to try to share my screen and see if that works. Can you see something on your screen?
Looks good.
It looks good. Okay. Okay. So the paper is, as Marta said, a comparison between Smith and Menger on value. And we like the title, Diamonds Are Not Forever, because depending on how we look at diamonds, we may think that diamonds can be forever or cannot be forever. So the puzzle that we started with is, what do we do if we do have a large amount of diamonds that are available to everybody? And that may be because we have knockoffs that are indistinguishable from the real ones, or because we just have a lot of real ones. Doesn't matter. If everybody is able to access diamonds, what do we do with them? And I think that we could safely answer that the answer is it depends. And in particular, it depends on which theory of values we are going to use. So if we use a theory of value that is Mengerian, then we would use diamonds to start to decorate things outside diamond rings, and all the way down to have your cell phone case covered in diamonds. But if you have a theory of value that is Smithian, then you would just dismiss diamonds and not use them anymore. And you may start to spend your money by giving to charity instead. And I'm going to explain why that is the case throughout the presentation. So the theory of value that Menger uses is a theory of value that relates needs and objects, so that we have a need, we find an object that fulfills our need, and that is what gives value to the object. But for Smith, that is not necessarily the case, because yes, we do have a need, we do have an object that fulfills it, but that fulfillment of value, the fulfillment of the need is given value only because there are others that value it. So that the relationship between need and object is mediated by the presence of other. Is through the eyes of others that we are able to appreciate the value of an object that fulfills our need. So we need to have the other in order to have value. Without the presence of other, an object may not necessarily fulfill any of our needs and therefore has no value. Why is that the case? Because I think, Jimena and I think that Menger and Smith have very radically different theories of human beings. In particular, Menger has a Robinson Crusoe idea of individual. As an idea of individual that is atomistic in nature, so it can perfectly live by himself on a desert island. And indeed, that's how Menger explains this theory of value. Every time he starts to describe a theory of value, he tells us that, he wants to explain a part of his theory of value. He tells us, let's imagine an individual who lives on a desert island. And he calls this individual eventually also Robinson Crusoe. So it doesn't shy away to the idea that an individual is somebody who lives in isolation. For Smith, that is complete nonsense. It is impossible to think or to understand individuals as individuals. Individuals are always social creatures. You cannot be by yourself. You cannot understand yourself if you're by yourself. You cannot do anything if you are on your own. You need to have always another in front of you who looks at you so that you can see yourself in the reflection of another. So the other is the mirror, in Smith's account, is the mirror through which we see each other and we see ourselves. So without the presence of others, we are not there. We are there only because the other is able to see us, and we act accordingly. So that we do something because we want to receive the other's approbation. And that's the main drive in Smith's system. So whenever we have a ranking of needs, Smith and Menger present very different things. In Menger's case, the preservation of one's life is the most important need to be fulfilled. In Smith's case, on the other hand, it is the approbation of others that we want to receive. They can take different forms, don't take me wrong, but nevertheless, for Smith, we do what we do because we want to receive the approbation of others. And the approbation should be deserved, but nevertheless, it is the approbation of others. In Smith's, in Menger's instead, we first want to preserve our life, and then we want to live in a more comfortable way. So, given these different starting points, what we are going to see is that when scarcity decreases, we're going to have two very different reactions in the system of value that is determined by Menger and the one that is determined by Smith. As scarcity decreases for Menger, an individual fulfills first his most important needs, then the needs that are less important, then the needs that are even less important. And so with the decrease of scarcity, we fulfill our most important need in a decreasing order. These are generally needs that can be fulfilled and are fulfilled on your own. Yes, it is true that society is there, society helps you, but it is possible to imagine a never dying Robinson Crusoe that is able to, with his own experience, to develop the knowledge that allows him to understand what are the objects that best fulfill his needs. It is possible to think again in a in a Robinson Crusoe approach, and again it can be Never Dying Robinson Crusoe, in which his needs may change over time, but nevertheless, the Mengerian model allows you to think that a Robinson Crusoe can do everything by himself. The other is not indispensable. Even when there is trade, the other is just a machine. It's just a mechanical way to obtain more. So it's no different than an increase in technology or a change in technology, the presence of others. For Smith, that's a very, very, very different story. For Smith, everything that we do is because we want to attract the attention of others. We want to distinguish ourselves from others in a good way. So we want to attract their attention, attract their approbation. And this goes from small things to big things. So even like a meal for Smith is something that we will use to distinguish ourselves from others. So we don't just eat, we want to eat in a way that shows our status. We dress, but we dress in a way that attracts the approbation of others, and does not attract instead the disapprobation of others. And so it does make a difference whether you are wearing a linen shirt or not in specific context. What this implies is that when we introduce abundancy, things will be very different. So for Menger, going back to our diamond situation, we're using diamonds for more and more frivolous things if we have an abundance of it. Smith thinks of diamonds in terms of, for example, a diamond buckle that a noble is willing to buy to distinguish himself by selling their birthrights. And the reason why they're willing to sell their birthrights is because now they can have something to show off that others don't have. And they are the only one who can have it. But again, if diamonds become abundant so that anybody can have diamonds, then they lose that power of distinguish ourselves from others. And this is why you start to look for other things that cannot be faked. And charity is one of those examples. One other way of thinking of the difference between Menger and Smith in terms of their understanding of value and the fact that Menger works with an environment in which there is only one Robinson Crusoe, and Smith instead works in a social context in which you can't detach one aspect of human being from the other, and you can't detach one human being from another human being, could be the use of multiple copies of the same book. So we have an anecdote that the University of Edinburgh acquired a second edition of The Wealth of Nations. So what do you do with the first edition of The Wealth of Nations? Well, if you are a Mengerian, which apparently the University of Edinburgh was at that time, you use the first edition as a step to reach on a higher shelf. On the other hand, if you have a second edition or a more recent edition of The Wealth of Nations, and you work more in the Smithian framework, you use the first edition to show off. And so you are able to sell the first edition for $500,000 today, as opposed to use it as a step for reaching higher books in a bookshelf. So those gives you the differences between Menger and Smith in their understanding of value. I think that gives you very, very different perspective and very, very different answers on how you handle abundance. And with this, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open to question.
All right, yeah, excellent. So we can form from the queue, yeah. Oh, and Roger, I guess let's start with you.
But I think you need to unmute yourself, Roger.
I was just saying, evidently I am the quickest to speak before thinking in this group, so it's very embarrassing to be first in line. I just wondered how, I think this makes a lot of sense. You know, you've got that sort of rigid, universal, categorical structure in Menger, right? So every human mind is the same, or should I say every man's mind is the same. And that's decidedly not true for Smith. So I think this is fabulous. I just wondered if you would say a few words on relating to two things. There's all this Robert Frank stuff about positional goods, okay? And then there's the Akerlof stuff on identity. You know, he has that sort of, I think, magnificent contrivance of sticking a bit string of zeros and ones into the middle of as an argument in the utility function that reflects some notion of identity. And, you know, with Smith, it's kind of different than I recall Akerlof doing, because your identity is not just that you have the virtues of, you know, courage if you're a soldier or whatever like that, but somehow you're modeling the other person's model. I don't know how you get that into a utility function, but anyway, what's the relation to Akerlof and identity? What's the relationship to Frank and positional goods?
Jimena, do you want to answer, or how do you do it?
You start.
I start, okay. Okay. Let me see if I can if I can start, and then Jimena will follow and fill in and correct me. I want to say that most goods, if not all goods, for Smith are status goods, so that our consumption is always driven by how others are looking at us. And again, it goes from shoes to food. All the examples that it gives are all examples in which it tells us, like, we prefer to have certain thing compared to others because this is what is proper. This is what is expected of us. And if not, we will be ashamed. And so if it is proper to wear shoes in public, like it is, for example, in England, for both men and women, then not wearing shoes is going to make you an object of shame. If, on the other hand, you are a woman in France, it's okay to go without shoes, and you go without shoes. Right? So what you're thinking in Smith's term is you are going to acquire certain things because of how others are going to judge you, or how others are going to approve you or disapprove you. So everything is done that way. So all your actions and all your consumption is driven by how others are going to see you and how you perceive that the others are going to see you. So in that sense, I think that all of our consumption in Smith's framework is positional.
Yeah, it's great.
And in terms of identity, it would be very uncomfortable to think of Smith as just adding stuff into a utility function, right?
Yeah.
It's just not how it works. It is, how do you look at me? My identity depends on how you see me. My identity depends on the eyes or the mirror that in which I'm reflecting myself. So it's not something that I put into my utility function, but is something that I look at by looking at you, looking at me. So my identity is formed by the presence of others that are looking at me and me being aware of the fact that the others are looking at me. And maybe Jimena can add to this.
Just two little things. I think regarding positional goods, I don't think we're pointing only at things that can be related to status, but it's more fundamental in that way. It's who you are. What you consume gives others also, even your consumption patterns gives others the view, the image of who you are, and you become someone because with others you consume. So it's consumption in the eyes of others and it's consumption with other people. So in that way, I'd say going a bit further that economics would not start with production, but rather with consumption, right? And that I think is a difference between Menger and Smith also, because we're not thinking about goods in terms of higher order goods, because you discover how an object, as Maria Pia said, satisfies a need, and how you can, for example, diamonds can be used to produce other things and they become higher order things because they're not consumed directly, which is not the case in Smith. You don't produce things and then consume. It's rather that consumption is at the center because it's the social thing that allows you to be someone. Maria Pia said it, and I would like to underscore that. It's, you just do not exist without others. There's no definition of a human being if there is not somebody else. And I think consumption would be like the link that allows other people to see who you are, and for you also to build yourself and your own identity.
Okay, that stimulates further thoughts, but I'll just go back in the queue.
I think it's Dave now, then Roger, then Dick, and Roger, and Nate. But anyway, Dave, it's your turn.
Yeah, no, so at some level, you might have answered my question with your previous answer, but I want to ask it anyway, just in case you didn't, or if I'm misunderstanding something. So for like food, right? I can readily understand, everything you guys have said, but obviously there's different qualities or gradations of foods. Like a filet mignon would be a very elaborate and expensive steak versus some other cheaper cut. And this is like, I'm demonstrating how little I know about steak, right? But clearly, I think Adam Smith, the theory of value that you've explained can explain why someone would go buy a filet mignon instead of some cheaper cut of meat. But it's been a while since I've read Menger, so I will defer to your statement or your judgment here. But I don't remember anything in Menger ruling out people buying filet mignon instead of some other cheaper food instead. But that seems to be what you've said that Menger would suggest that we do, is that we find sort of the thing that fills our bellies at the least price. And that wouldn't be filet mignon, right? It would be, chuck roast or something else instead. And maybe there's differences in like the taste of the meat that might account for this. Like you just enjoy meat. And so I don't know, like, do you see kind of like where I'm trying to go with this, where I don't know that Menger rules out sort of quality or other things than simply just satisfying the immediate physical need. There can still be a social element to Menger, and it can still be consistent with Menger. Is that quite okay?
Yeah. I don't think that's what we're saying. That Menger would rule these things out. Actually, he does see that you can consume goods. Not his sense of preserving your life is not just your physical basic needs, right? Physiological needs. It's comfort also, but comfort is not defined by your relationship with others. So like Robinson Crusoe just says, okay, I know I can eat whatever steak I get, but maybe it would be nicer, just because I like it more, to have a better piece of meat. But it's not necessarily because Friday comes into the picture. It's just that we prefer to have a more comfortable life. Now, the question, there is something that we do is that we're reading the principles mainly, right? So just in the principles, when Menger gives examples of things that give a comfortable life, and he spends a lot of time defining or telling how needs might change, but there's nothing really social in the change of needs. It's always that people have more knowledge, accumulated knowledge that passes through time, is like a social knowledge about these things are better than others to satisfy our needs for a good life, a comfortable life. And that's the example we use in the paper about the witch doctor and the real doctor. So at a point, it's like, you know that a witch doctor just won't cure you, so you don't use that witch doctor anymore. But what maybe Smith would be saying is, maybe you do, even if you know that the real doctor is better. There is something in a social type of consumption pattern that says, well, you can use these kind of medicine also. It's so no goods really disappear in Smith because you find something that better fulfills the need. Actually, they would change and maybe come back into fashion. It all depends on scarcity, and it all depends on what we are trying to signal about ourselves to others, which is the point I think that is not there in Menger.
And I'm going to reiterate what Jimena just said. So if you want to use the filet mignon story in Menger, I think I would say the following. You are hungry, and then you start with eating a burger, and then you learn that the burger has a lot of fat in it and may not be the best meat, and then you discover filet mignon, and it's like, oh, now I know that there is a better way to feed myself, and so I'm going to use filet mignon for most of my meals, and put the burger into the most the lesser uses I make. I don't know, tomato sauce with the burger meat. So that would be the story that Menger would tell you why you start to use filet mignon as opposed to burger meat. Smith would say instead that if everybody is eating burgers and you want to show off, you're going to have a big dinner party and serve filet mignon. That's the story that Smith would say. So again, there may be a bit of truth in both, but the Smith story is that you drive your consumption because of how you want to appear in the eyes of others. And if you want to distinguish yourself from others and everybody eats burger, then you're definitely going to make a big impact on them if at your dinner party you're going to offer filet mignon.
All righty. Well, okay, let's move on maybe to Dick, if that's all right. Yeah.
Okay, I like where you all are going with this, in part because I think there is a fundamental divergence between whether economics is an approach to theories of social organization or whether it's bound up in ideas about the constituents of rational conduct, with the latter being more of a 19th century development. I think if I were to look upon the main part of your paper as being an exercise in the history of economics where you're trying to rank the pantheon of the gods from times past, and you're saying that here are reasons why Smith should rank higher than Menger, I would certainly say you're right, that Smith was all in on economics as a theory of social organization. Menger had that too, but he also got a lot of beginnings of rational conduct in there with his correspondence with Leon Walras and so forth. But two things, though, that puts me only 80%, I suppose I would have to say on your side in this respect. One of which is, I suspect you buy into a theory of sociology that I reject, or theory of sociality, I should say, which I think fighting is a social activity. Wars are social activity that are all rooted very deeply in the human animal, the human spirit. And the source of fights, wars, and so forth are, in a way, I would claim, are likewise rooted in whatever it is in us that leads us to seek approbation. It doesn't have to be approbation that everyone embraces in a society. But I think there probably is a danger in thinking of society as some sort of mass of very similar folks. If you think about it as a fissured ice field, there are, I think, all kinds of margins of action where people can gather a sufficient number of bands of admirers to go through life comfortably, and in the process making misery for other people. So I'm not sure, I don't know this for a fact for the two of you, but I have the suspicion that when you use terms like approbation, sociology, you're trying to create a kind of an image or a theory suitable for a very peaceful, placid society. I don't think societies are anything like peaceful placidity and so forth. I think all societies exist in states of varying degrees of civil warfare, where the challenge is continually, just like is going on in Europe now, is beginning to get stronger. And I happen to think that we're going to see much more of this in the world at large over the next 10, 20 years. But so there's a question of what, it's like a question of what are the prospects for organized humanity, which is the Adam Smith question. And so, you know, that's, anyhow, and let me just say one other thing that I want to stop, which, what should I make of the wording of the two of you on this? Here's a quotation, not a quotation, but it points to something that when I see it, it disturbs me. And in talking about Menger, you say Menger, quote, value is to Menger. Then when you get to Smith, say, value may be interpreted, ... It's like, you know, I guess I'm very much of a realist in my theorization and like to think that what I'm theorizing about is real. It's not my interpretation of him, and that's what I dislike about an awful lot of modern literary stuff and so forth. So I don't know if there's something significant in that or what, but say I like it. I think there is an absolute fundamental distinction where the Smithian vision of economics leads into a general theory of social organization. I don't think Menger leads into a theory of administration and rational action, but he isn't as complete or as full as Smith either. So that's why I say I like it, but I can't endorse it 100% as against, say, 90% or something like that.
So thank you. Thank you for these questions. I think we'll have to answer each one of us this time because this is something we haven't really thought about. So I'll try like venturing on things and see if my co-author agrees. Actually, I think she does, but let's see. And I'll leave most of the second question to Maria Pia because that is harder about the wording. So for the first one, I understand why you have this impression of us like pushing an idea of sociability, let's say, of being peaceful and everything going well. And we're talking about people wanting the approbation of others without any specification of what those others might look like or might mean. So, but I don't think that would not allow for violence and for not so peaceful relationships. And there you have many things in Smith that point to this, like, for example, the place of envy in consumption. So there is envy in and that we talk about in the paper of the poor and the rich, right? So the envy of the poor that might lead them to have a violent behaviors against the property of the rich, just because they don't have the haves and the have-nots, is something that is present in Smith. So envy is something that would lead to violent outcomes as also a possibility of social interactions. Somebody that is excluded from consumption. And there is also the fact that there are smaller groups or communities that are formed. So who is the other? Who is the relevant spectator? Who is the relevant other in whose eyes I am forming my image and my reflection? I think that's an important case to make, that you can have contending, contrary, opposite groups that, again, might just become violent against each other. So there is this kind of exclusion that is happening through the groups that are being formed. The asymmetry of sympathy is something that Smith also develops a lot. And in this case, there are things that you do not want to see. And so that means that you make somebody invisible. You turn your head, and Smith says this, not to see those who are in misery, in misery in any like kind of way. So you don't want to see them. You don't want to engage in the sympathetic process with these people. And that might be a very violent way to ignore and to even like deny the humanity of someone. If you don't look at that person does not belong to your community. That person is excluded from your gaze, and you refuse to look at that person stops being a person. When he describes the situation of the poor and the miserable, Smith is very clear on the fact that they are in obscurity. They are ignored. They are cast out. So that's also a source of social instability, let's say. So there are a lot of ways to see that even this way of forming communities, of forming yourself in the eyes of others, does not mean that everybody belongs to the same community, or that there is homogeneity in society, or everybody looks the same way to each other. There are different patterns of consumption, and there are different ways to relate with each other that might be peaceful or not. And in the example, and with this I'll be ending, in the example of religions, for example, that is also a way that you can see there are ways in which Smith gives space to the possibility of violent interactions between human beings that belong to different communities and to different sects. So I understand why you get the impression of we are pushing this idea of a peaceful and prosperous society, but maybe it's because we're just focusing on that side in this paper, but that does not mean that the other side, which is violence and conflict, is not present in Smith, also using exactly the same analytical apparatus, I would say. And on the second question, I'll just say, well, I hadn't realized actually that we were saying, like, for Menger, value is, and for Smith, value may be interpreted as. I think we are at a point that we will say value is for Smith also, but we are maybe more aware of the Smith scholarship and everything that has been said about Smith's theory of value as being something not at all what we are saying. So that's what we're saying. Well, this is like our view, and maybe being a bit more cautious about defining exactly what value is in Smith than in Menger.
Right. And I think the last answer is like what I also think is like the way in which we present Menger's on value is not necessarily controversial. I think that's a standard reading of Menger. While Smith, for Smith, we are offering an alternative view to the current literature, and I am not comfortable in saying you're wrong, and I am right, because I mean, Smith is Smith, and or any author who's dead cannot tell you exactly what they meant when they wrote. So there have been very smart people in the past who have interpreted Smith in a way that is different from the way in which we are doing it. And I think I'm comfortable in saying has Smith's value may be interpreted as. I'm quite comfortable with that. Even I may believe that it is, but I'm more comfortable in saying that it may be interpreted as. And in terms of fighting, I think Jimena pointed to the fact that we're focusing on one specific aspect, which is value theory. So maybe part of the impression that you got is due to the limitation of the scope of the paper, but Smith is I do not believe that Smith is an author that thinks that harmony of interest is what emerges from interaction with human beings. My reading of The Wealth of Nations is a book about conflicts, and not necessarily about resolution of conflicts. It's a book about like description of conflicts. If you think of all the way in which it describes mercantilists and the lobbying is a very violent way of achieving your own benefit at the expense of others, and you're willing to use war to do it without any problems. That said, I think that there is actually something interesting, though, in your point, because I am not aware of Menger's theory of war, or if Menger has any explanation or justification or description of anything, any analysis that can lead us to a war. And if you take him seriously when we say that, when he says that life, the preservation of life, is the most important goal in individuals, then in a sense he's ruling out war by that definition. Because if the most important thing for me is the preservation of my life, the most important thing for you is the preservation of your life, then we can't have war. On the other hand, Smith does never preclude the absence of war. War is always a possibility. And it is very possible that I achieve approbation by killing my enemy. As a matter of fact, in many situations, that's how you rise to glory. And he has no problem in explaining how you're willing to give up your life to the promotion of glory, or for your future glory, by killing others and being killed yourself. So in that sense, I don't think that if you want to introduce even conflict in this dichotomy that we are trying to sketch, it is easier for Smith to explain war than for Menger to explain war.
All right. Very good. So I'm pretty sure we'll return to this point, but let's give Roger a chance to ask his question.
Well, let me go behind folks who haven't spoken yet. I think that's all.
Okay. Okay. So Nathan and Jim.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. This is brilliant. I shared this paper with my student, Eli Sparks, who's here with us, and he wrote a summer research paper for us here at ISPE, thinking about value across various different thinkers. So it's been already disseminated. But I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, the title of your paper might be The Invisible Hand Wears Prada. Because that's kind of what you're getting at, is these social approbation goods. And the stuff about conflict that just has come up, I don't think that there's a reasonable explanation from the Mengerian point of view for how collusion initiates, whereas from the Smithian concept of value as you've described it, given that there's social distance that generates a problem, and approbation cannot scale up the same way that other goods can. So if you think about the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, for approbation that really becomes a big problem. So I think that that Smith has a good way of getting at factions and conflict, and it's actually more consistent than I don't even think that Menger has an explanation of how faction forms. I could be wrong. This also shows up in other uses or other ways of thinking. My first thought is, what about Edgeworth? And whether Edgeworth has a more, because he's between Smith and Menger, I think, does he have a more Mengerian or a more Smithian conception of value? And given that Edgeworth talks about sympathy and talks about Crusoe, but when he talks about Crusoe, he always also includes Friday. So that might be a way to get at some of these things. And finally, with the filet mignon, if you watch chef shows, after the chefs make their beautiful fancy dishes, they go in the back room and eat peanut butter and jelly or some other crap, right? It's always the case that they're always eating some sort of garbage behind the scenes. So finally, I brought this up in my dissertation, but in Mises, his understanding of the word catalactics is completely the Mengerian version that you've described here in terms of value. He doesn't have a Whatelian version of catalactics that includes exchange of sympathies, and that doesn't get fixed at all really until Hayek a little bit, and not even fully there.
Thank you for all the ideas. I like the title, of course. But so I won't say much. Maybe we should look at Edgeworth, but I don't have enough information just to react to that. There was just one little thing I wanted to react to. Again, with the filet mignon and going to the back and eating peanut butter and jelly. I think that's interesting because there is, I think, an idea of deception in consumption. And Smith gives this example of you're standing with somebody and you see a grand lady entering the room and you see her hair full of glittering stones and you think, wow, that's diamonds and it's so beautiful and everything. And then the person just next to you says, oh, well, then they're not real diamonds. And that just kills off all the admiration you had. So it's the fact that you consume in the light. And that is what gives you the approbation that you're looking for. Maybe it may be fashion, it may be admiration of another type, but it's the fact that you consume in the light, in the public light, to call it some way. So I think that idea of deception in consumption is very powerful, and might be, and we might work on it, thinking precisely the difference between vanity and praiseworthiness, that kind of things. Who are you consuming before? What are you consuming? And if that consumption is broadly seen or not.
Let me add a little bit more than on, since you brought it up again, Nathan. The problem of approbation and collusion. And I mean, as I mentioned before, the way I'm reading The Wealth of Nations is a very conflict-driven analysis. And why do you collude? Because you want to reduce the size of the market. Why do you want to reduce the size of the market? Because you want to increase your profit. Why do you want to increase your profit? Because you want to gain a lot of diamonds to show off, because nobody has them. So you have these big opportunities to make huge profits with the discovery of the new world. Do you really want to let others get all that approbation from it? No, you want to make sure that you have a piece of it. And the way to do it is to make sure that your competitors are not in the way. And so you lobby for government protection so that you are the one who can access those markets and can monopolize those markets. Because the gains that you will receive will push you up in status, because now you can show off way more than you could before. Right? So I think that the mechanism of approbation or our desire to receive approbation of others to be looked at is a very powerful mechanism that allows you to explain factions, to explain collusion, to explain monopolies, and it becomes a little bit more problematic again once you reach Menger, because I think that the problems are a little bit more chunky in that sense. I don't know enough about Edwards to be able to give you any comments on it. Aside like the textbook explanation of Edward that is like two indifference curves that meet. And if that is the case, then I think that you have like Menger doubled up, and you just have another way of, again, you use the other as a technology to increase your consumption. And if that is the case, then there is no difference between, in a sense, Menger and Edward. But I don't know enough about Edward to be able to tell you anything more than the textual, so the textbook. I don't know if it's a caricature, but the textbook stylized version of it.
All right, very good. I think Jim now, and before we go to Dick, I'm gonna insert myself after Jim, so go ahead, Jim.
Yeah. So thank you both for the paper. In looking at this distinction between Menger and Smith, maybe you're already thinking about this, but I just wanted to state this clearly. Smith, when he's looking at economics is economic theory, market exchange, if we understand his trajectory from the theory of moral sentiments, he's saying we have not just sympathy is important, sympathy is driving a lot, but when he looks at activity in the market, he sees those who are most in conformity with the impartial spectator as basically entrepreneurs who are subject to the competitive forces of the market. And so if we understand it from that light, it's very easy with Smith to try to emphasize sympathy. But I think when we look at Smith's economics, we need to be emphasizing the impartial spectator. And he recognizes that there's an incompleteness if your actions are in conformity with the impartial spectator. There's some sort of wisdom lacking. Perhaps there's even some sort of sociality lacking beyond the narrow self-interest. But I wasn't sure that I was picking that up. If we look at Menger, we're talking about causal genetic story. And again, even more so, I see that as more within the confines of the impartial spectator, this causal genetic story operating within rather more narrow self-interest. And my last comment in light of what we've been talking about with war, I think if you look at the connection, say, from Menger to Buchanan's limits of liberty, you see something like similar causal genetic story, a little bit less in constraints in terms of how you're interacting with one another, right? Because that story invites violence. It says violence is part of the game that we're playing, and we use this economic calculus in order to do that. And I'm not saying it's precisely Mengerian, because Buchanan was using a bit different of an approach, but I think it has a lot in common with Menger's causal genetic approach if we want to think about that problem there. Not really a question, but in terms of framing, I found that helpful. And I was hoping to hear a little bit more about the constraints of the impartial spectator as we were talking about this.
I have to think a little bit, but because I don't know if I'm really understanding your point, because I don't see a disconnection between like the sympathetic process and the impartial spectator. You know, like the impartial spectator would not be something that can happen or that we can think about removed from the sympathetic and thus the social process. So maybe you can, yeah.
Yeah, I'll clarify really simply. Scrooge, his actions very often were in conformity with the impartial spectator. If we think of like a very narrow-minded capitalist, let's say. But that's not necessarily meaning that he had sympathy, at least not in a very deep sense if he did.
I think that's a kind of a problematic view. I in the sense that the impartial spectator in Smith is described as this figure that is especially sensitive and sensible. So it would be difficult, I think, to advance that the impartial spectator would not be precisely involved in this kind of social interactions that we're talking about. So in that sense, I do not identify the impartial spectator with narrow self-interest, quite the contrary. I think the impartial spectator is precisely the idea of an extended self, which is very hard to come by. So actually, I think that what Smith would be saying is that like the bulk of mankind can be led by the partial spectator rather than the impartial spectator. And that partial spectator looks very much like public opinion and this idea of what fashion is, for example. And that's why he makes a difference between the path of virtue and the path of fortune or wealth. Precisely because he's saying the path of virtue it's much more difficult, and it's these people who only listen to their impartial spectator in every case. An impartial spectator is this figure that has complete information about your motives and about your feelings and about the motivations of your behavior, of why you are doing things. And there's like no way to fool this impartial spectator who has been developed as a sort of conscience. I'm going fast here, but that knows exactly why you're doing the things you're doing and makes a difference. For example, as I was saying before, makes a difference between vanity and praiseworthiness. If you're really worthy of the approbation you're receiving, or you're just faking something. Whereas the partial spectator would be like the rapid applause of what you want to believe about yourself, even if it's not true. So that's why I'm having trouble like following your position on the impartial spectator being something that so that's the thing. I'm not sure if we disagree either, but that's the point, that I don't see the impartial spectator like being related to the behavior in the market, as if the behavior in the market could be isolated to each economic agent, to call it some way, without regard for precisely what other people are seeing, feeling, and thinking about what you are doing in the market.
And I think I'm going to add to what Jimena just said in terms of you can have both. You can have different kinds of entrepreneurs. You can have an entrepreneur that is following virtue, like the brewer, the baker, the butcher, that Smith talks about at the beginning of the Wealth of Nations. But you can also have entrepreneurs like the big merchant, the manufacturers that are capturing the state to gain monopoly power. So whenever you have large gains, like large possible gains, like large profit opportunities, you are tempting an entrepreneur to behave in ways that are not approvable. But the entrepreneur will do it anyway. So the big merchant and manufacturer are still going through, even though they are pretty much aware of the fact that they're causing a lot of distress in a lot of people, including death of a lot of people. But they're doing it anyway because their gains are going to be so strong, so large, that their status is going to be so much higher that people would just admire them just because they're so wealthy now. And if they use means of achieving that wealth that are questionable, we tend to forget. We tend to dismiss them because they're so wealthy. So there is this imbalance between how we look at the rich and how we look at the poor. And we tend to forgive the rich much more than we forgive the poor for the same bad action. That and so you are willing to make that gamble to jump on status through means that are not necessarily approvable, because if you do make it, then you receive approbations. So those are the two paths that Jimena was talking about, like the road of the path of virtue and the path of wealth, is very. The majority of people would be just like the baker, the brewer, and the butcher, and they would be much more virtuous in their dealing with others. But Smith doesn't close the door to the possibility that a partial spectator can go somewhere else and let me gain while I can and receive the approbation of others, and then I'll worry about the consequences later. And actually, I will have no consequences because people will admire me for my wealth. So Smith is very malleable in a sense. He offers a model that can fit in many different circumstances. And I'm not sure that Menger has that ability. Menger is very fixed because there's only you. That the other is just a tool in a sense. And so it doesn't matter what they think. It doesn't, I will achieve more. I will find more means to fulfill my needs. And that's the end of Menger's story. So it is a much simpler story, much more linear story, but is also a story that prevents, I think, a lot of the explanation that Smith may offer. In terms of a line, Menger Buchanan, I don't know. I am not. I'm skeptical that there is a line between Menger and Buchanan. I think Buchanan is much closer to Smith than to Menger, exactly for the reasons that Jimena and I are talking about in this paper. Buchanan was very adamant about the fact that humans are social beings, and to start with Homo economicus is nonsense. And so you end up with utility functions. You start with utility function and you end up with utility function, and there's nothing there. And economics is about exchange, and exchange implies having multiple individuals interacting with each other. And so when you start from Robinson Crusoe, according to Jim, you're starting from the wrong premises. So I think that Buchanan would be much closer to Smith than to Menger.
All right. So I actually have a question on shifting maybe a little bit, right? Because the paper and the discussion so far has been focused on consumption, right? Choices in what we consume. But how do you think these two understandings of value affect sort of the understanding of entrepreneurship in terms of value creation, right? And novelty, and where does novelty enter, right? Because if we just take the super simple understanding of Smith and all we do is approbation, then it will be hard to imagine we ever venture to do anything new unless that becomes socially valuable. So maybe I'm foreshadowing McCleskey here, but yeah, I would love to hear you comment a little bit about value creation in the two for the two thinkers.
I'd just start by saying that on the contrary, I think there's a lot of space for novelty, precisely because what is new is scarce. And what is scarce is what makes you stand out from the crowd. So you will be looked at, maybe curiously, maybe even like with surprise when you appear with something nobody else has. I think that's also the example we use about the stockings for the Queen. Nobody had stockings in England when the Queen receives them from the Spanish ambassador. And so everybody's very admired and admirative of these stockings, which are a technological innovation. So I think there is a complete link between this search for being different and looking different from others, distinguishing yourselves, standing out from the crowd, so you are more visible, so people will see you more. The light of the scene will be focused on you if you have something that nobody else has, and that is something that will happen with novelty, of course. So I think there is an explanation of this entrepreneurship, of the spirit of the entrepreneur, just because if you innovate, you can have people looking at you, and and that explains why you have this race again for having and producing what others are producing, but actually you always have to make this next step to be the one who's producing something that nobody else has.
And like, look at book 3 in the Wealth of Nations, in a sense, where the diamond buckles are introduced. That's, in a sense, is an entrepreneurial story, and is a story of value creation from the beginning to the end. Right? Like, you're stuck in a town in which you have nothing to eat. What do? Well, you go look for food elsewhere because you can't look in your countryside, right, because they're fighting outside. So you go into long distance trade, and you bring back something that nobody else has. And you go to your lord and says, look, I have a diamond buckle. I can give it to you. You're going to be the only one with a diamond buckle. I mean, that is an entrepreneurial story, right? That is somebody who sees the value, the potential value of something that is very scarce, goes to a lord and says, you can share the food with everybody else, but this is going to be yours. So it is, for Smith, is value creation that appeals to a childish vanity, but nevertheless, it is value creation. Right.
Excellent. All righty. So now Roger and then Dick. Yeah, and that's probably all that we will have time for.
Oh man, I'm dizzy now. I don't know where to begin. This is really great. Menger has appendix. I looked it up. So appendix 6 of the investigations. Menger has this appendix. The starting point and the goal of all human economy are strictly determined. So, you know, on the one hand, he's got all this wonderful stuff about like knowledge. There's that beautiful passage about the growth of knowledge in the Principles. But then he can write the starting point and goal of all human economy are strictly determined. And I think you really kind of put your finger on it. With Menger, there's one mind. With Smith, there are always at least two. And this makes all the difference. So I'm right with you. I think you really nailed it. And you helped me to understand what was wrong. I happened to be in a workshop, this kind of vivid memory where Akerlof was vetting this idea of the identity and utility function before it had yet been published. And we were all objecting, a lot of like Austrians in the audience, and we were all like, no, that's not identity. And none of us could quite pin down where Akerlof was going wrong. I think you finally, however many decades later now, nailed it for me. Right? Akerlof still has one mind, and there must be, for identity, at least two. So I think this is like actually a major thing, and I really love it. Sort of the next, but sort of the next thing is to sort of connect this to, you know, our anthropological past, you know, caveman, right? So that's a whole nother different project. But it's very important, I think, to link it to our evolutionary psychology, to the social structure of archaic humans, to the emergence of composite tools, to the early emergence of trade, which we now think was probably between 500 and 300,000 years ago, which is like way back, all that stuff. So we got to make those connections, but that's a different project. The only thing I would just maybe ask Jimena, if you'll forgive me for however I'm probably butchering your poor innocent name. I don't get how consumption is first in Smith. Let me put it like this, right? Chimps and bonobos are social creatures. Is consumption first for chimps and bonobos? I don't even know what that means.
So maybe what I'm saying about consumption is first is just the fact that consumption is the way you relate and exchange with others, and it's the way that you distinguish yourself through goods. So you use things, you consume things, so that people look at you in a specific way. So it's probably more that sense in which I'm saying it is this idea of having people look at you that is more, visible, and in that sense it is maybe Veblen is kind of what I'm looking at. It would, I think it would not make much sense in Smith to say, well, we produce to survive or to whatever, and first we produce. I think it would be like the other way around. First we consume, and then we start with the production processes that allows us to consume more or differently or something else. It's in that sense that I'm saying consumption is first.
Right, and let me add to this, Roger. Smith is explicit about saying that consumption is the goal of production, and is not production for its own sake, right? Because if you think that production is the goal, then you are a mercantilist, right? The whole goal of production is
Yeah, okay, no,
consumption.
if that's all it's meant by consumption is first, then yeah, absolutely.
But you consume in more than what is needed to survive, and you consume, even when you're consuming for survival, you try to consume things that are fancier, because you want to use consumption as a way to make a statement about yourself. So
If I make a badass spear that's better at killing a woolly mammoth, that's a hell of a statement, right? The better spear maker, he's going to get laid. Okay, so it's, I think, I don't understand consumption coming first. I'm not buying it. Consumption, production is for consumption, absolutely, and there's the social dimension, but production has its prestige value as well.
Let's put it in a slightly different context. Which may not be correct, but bear with me. If I have this super special spear that kills the mammoth, but nobody sees me, doesn't matter. And I think that's Smith's point.
I mean, it's very important that everybody knows I killed the woolly mammoth, or my spear.
But that's
was used
exactly
to
the
kill woolly
point.
mammoth.
So it is the recognition of the other,
Sure.
and you can
So maybe it's just a semantic point that maybe the phrase consumption first or consumption maybe doesn't convey what you're trying to get at with this sort of reflexivity. Maybe my objections are just really to exposition. I don't know.
It may be, but again, I think the problem is simply like, are you visible? And is in a commercial society is much easier to be visible through consumption and through production.
But I think there's also this point about the labor theory of value, right? Like value, according to labor theory of value, then value is given in production. And that is precisely where we do not want to go. It's not in production that value is produced. That is a major thing. Yeah. So you cannot have value if there is no exchange, and there's no exchange if you don't want to consume something. So it's also in that analytical sense, I'd say that I'm saying consumption is like the driving force of what is happening.
Yeah.
And just for the sake of argument, I'd say you're consuming the sphere when you're killing the mammals. So that's also a way of consumption.
All right. Maybe so. Dick, you had a question. Would you like to ask it now? Yeah.
Oh, I took my hand down because we're out of time, and
I'll wait.
Yeah, I think the 150, or what is it for you? 350 is we can go to 4, right? Again, I think that the 10 minutes is the margin. So
I won't take that much time. I was interested in the kind of problem the two of you are looking at. Strikes me that it's very suitable as a conceptual matter for some of the recent developments in computational type of modeling. Because what you see, until the development of some of these computational techniques, all modeling was fundamentally stipulational in character. That is to say, you stipulated properties of the object that you thought would give you what you wanted to get. And that's how theory has all developed. With the computational modeling has allowed further refinement of emergent style techniques of analysis, where more complex things emerge out of interaction among simpler elements. And it seems to me that in terms of what you're trying to get out of Smith, or where you're trying to take Smith, approbation, for instance, that all these say that there is some process. Approbation doesn't just happen. It happens in particular pathways through contacts and interactions among people. And it's, in thinking about your paper and listening to the conversation today, it seems to me that there certainly is room for, thinking on the one hand of, well, how would approbation processes have worked in Smith's time or in Menger's time? In Menger's time, it had probably more refinement in printing and so forth, but in modern times, not even Menger's times had television, let alone electronic media. And moreover, perhaps electronic media brings more into play, which is one of my favorite points. It goes to Frank Knight, who famously declared that, it's not our ignorance that hurts us. It's what we know that's not true. And I think there is a fundamental truth there. And I think it's one, that raises, do these approbation processes inevitably or only under some circumstances bring out the better side of ourselves? And that, I think, is the big question. I don't know how to answer, but I'd be glad if you two could. But anyway, that's all I had to say.
I know I don't know answer, but I think that's why Smith is so powerful, right? Because I think there is like clues into what he's saying about precisely approbation can lead to very different kind of behaviors and very different kind of approved behaviors and approved ways of being, which can come into conflict at different points and which change. And so what could be also interesting is to look a bit deeper into exactly what produces social change. Why is something that is approved somewhere, because it's also very contextual, that is not approved at another point of time or in another moment or place. So I think there is this possibility of really understanding these very complex processes through approbation that leads to very different social organizations, even if it's a process that can be like used as a framework in any case. That's, I think, what is so powerful in what Smith is proposing.
All right, Maria, any final words?
No, my final words are simply a great thank to all of you. And actually a special thank to Dick, because like this paper comes out of your, this is why I asked to present it here, because it does come out of your work on entangled political economy. And you and Roger invited me many years ago to that conference where you started to make me think of Smith as an entangled political economist. So a big thank to for that invitation to both of you, and in particular to Dick for this research agenda, which is very, very powerful. So thank you. And thank for all the comments, and thank to Jimena, who who managed to answer all the questions.
Did I? I tried.
Yeah. She was threatening me of not being here. Like, no, you have to be here to answer the questions.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you to the presenters, Maria, Pia, Jimena. Thank you very, very much. This was a very interesting, thoughtful discussion. And I think it's a good sign that we haven't really finished, right? Like, I'm sure there are many more questions we could discuss. So anyway, thank you for that. And next month we will have a presentation by Lin and Peng on postbellum electoral politics and the genesis of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So that's November 15th. I'll send out an email about that. But anyway, thank you all for today. Excellent work.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Bye,
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.